you could say Cornette's Drive-Thru on every major podcast platform known to humanity across the globe, coast to coast and continent to continent. You can find us everywhere. Instead, you say wherever you manage to locate us.
I could have said that. I'm just going to clip that and play that each week at the beginning of the show, I think.
Well, there you go. And see, and we're like the ESPN of podcasts, coast to coast, continent to continent, the AWA here on ESPN, ladies and gentlemen. And you see what it did for them. So,
did you watch it when it was on ESPN? I know you didn't watch the WWF TV ever. Did you ever watch AWA on ESPN?
Yeah, yes, because, well, and I don't say ever. I got tapes and would zip through them, and it didn't take long, of the WWF shows in those days. And I would watch major pay-per-view matches and etc. But the AWA, yeah, because there were so many guys that at one point had come through there and had been a part of the AWA. It was like that bad relationship again the last few years that you don't want to end, but it was like WCW, every promotion that falls from the heights of glory like it did in the late 80s. And I mean, as Bockwinkel was still on till nearly the last, and there were still some things going on that but I didn't sit there and watch with bated breath, or any other kind of breath for that matter, the whole entire program. And I got a kick at Don Fargo.
That's right. He showed up all of a sudden.
Wrestled on because he knew Commissioner Stanley Blackburn. Because AWA Commissioner Stanley Blackburn was in his normal day-to-day life, Stanley Blackburn, who worked for the Texas Department of Licensing and Standards, or whatever it was they called the group, that the organization that oversaw wrestling in those days, the equivalent of the commission, but it was something different like that. And because Blackburn used to come to Amarillo when we'd run out there in World Class, and then later on a couple times Crockett ran there in the late 80s. Stanley Blackburn would come to the show officially as a commissioner instead of a gimmick commissioner, but he was old friends with Vern and Wally Carbo and etc. So I know where's Don Fargo fit in this, right?
And his son was the referee in Amarillo for a while, Rip Blackburn, right?
Yes, he was. So the way Fargo fits in is because at one point, Don Fargo found himself in Amarillo, Texas, living with I guess a gang of bikers. And I think they were hopefully I believe the, innocent type of bikers. They weren't like, blowing shit up and running drugs everywhere. It was just a local biker group that Don came to the show in Amarillo one time when I was there with Bobby and Dennis in 86. I think first time Crockett went out there, whatever the case. And he said, it's great. He said, I just sit on the front porch of the house drinking beer and watching the guys wrestle each other and body slam each other on the concrete and shit.
All right.
But anyway, Stanley Blackburn was based in Amarillo, and since Don Fargo was there and they had known each other, but Stanley was not only helping Don get booked every now and then, but also if Don got booked and got paid with a check. So the story goes, as they told it, as we say in those days, Don Fargo didn't exist on paper to the federal government at this point in time, apparently, because Don Colt had his wallet stolen when he had a Texas driver's license in the days when you didn't have to have a photo on the Texas driver's license, and the guy who stole the wallet was later stabbed and killed in a biker bar. And so the authorities, for at least some period of time, I'm not sure, and once again, wrestler's exaggeration, but at some period of time, the officials thought Don Fargo was dead. So as not to fuck up this piece of good luck, he would have Stanley Blackburn cash all of his checks for him. And now that's what I heard part from Don and part from Stanley. But anyway, so that's why Stanley Blackburn got Don Fargo booked on AWA television on ESPN. And I saw one of the matches, at least. I don't know how many more he had, but one of them he worked with Jimmy Snuka. So here is a guy who started his career on network television on the Dumont network in the early 50s. and made it all the way to the fucking, I don't know if that was 87, 88, 89, whatever, to ESPN on national cable 40 years later. That was a pretty good fucking run.
How did Stanley Blackburn get hooked up with Vern?
Well, I don't know his whole goddamn biography, but they'd both been in the business 40 fucking years. So I'm sure at some point they'd cross paths, become friends, and Wally Carbo as well. Wally Carbo ended up being the goddamn figurehead commissioner of the Ladies Professional Wrestling Association because Tor Berg, the promoter in 1991, grew up in the Midwest, was a big fan of Vern Gagne, and Wally Carbo was the god of wrestling in those days. He was the guy who financed Vern Gagne, helped finance Vern to buy his part of the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Club.
I wonder how much he had to finance him.
It was a going concern in the 50s when Vern Gagne into that promotion. It was not as huge as it would become, but it had been operating and successfully for years and years. So I bet it was a pretty penny, but times were a changing back then in the late 50s, early 60s.
And they sure weren't. A lot of these guys did that. Bruiser, Sheik, Vern, a lot of guys bought into territories and succeeded. How many guys didn't? Like we know about Mulligan and Murdoch in Amarillo and then Mulligan and Flair in Knoxville, but how many guys actually bought into territories or bought territories outright and then just it didn't work at all?
Well, but that was the late 70s also, which was a whole different time than when the actual territories were forming. And you needed in a lot of places, like Memphis was one, for example, in the early 50s, the local promoters would bring in their main event guys, if they had any budget at all, would be off the national TV, whether from Chicago or from Hollywood or wherever, or the syndicated tapes from New York, whatever the period or the part of the country was. They'd bring in those guys for the main events, and then they'd bring in guys from booking offices around different places to fill in their undercard. But you'd have guys working all over. It wasn't specific territories didn't form until the network TV went away, and territories have always existed in some form because of where the booking offices were of talent. And Al Haft in Ohio in the 40s and 50s had huge groups of talent because it was in the middle of the country and they could go everywhere. But you didn't have those boundaries until after the network TV, promoters in those regions started getting their own local TV because now they needed TV. So they got their own local TV, and then if they got a significant cluster of stations, they needed a set group of talent to appear in all of the towns that they ran, and they generally were aided by having the hometown hero or the guy that was most over in that market to be involved in the promotion, either as the booker or part owner to make sure he stayed there, or they allowed him to buy in because of the business that he would bring. Vern Gagne in the AWA, Bruiser in Indianapolis, Eddie Graham, was the top guy. So he just, by process of elimination, he's a genius and he's the main event guy. So he's going to own this place sooner or later. And he did. All that that was really the mid to late 50s and early 60s. And I don't recall Roy Shire retiring from the ring and opening up San Francisco, because Barnett helped him get a sponsor for the TV. Back in those days, it was hard to fuck that up because there was already wrestling in a lot of those towns. You just needed to be formed better. But then by the late 70s, when the boys started buying territories, chances are they were buying them from the fucking Sharks.
Yeah. Ed Francis. That's what happened to Ed Francis.
The Fuller and Welch family sold a number of territories. I'm sure Ron, the Tennessee stud, can elucidate you on. And so it was harder then to make a go of it unless you had all those magic ingredients.
I believe in Hawaii, when Ed Francis bought the promotion from Al Karasik, the plan was Al Karasik was going to sit back and watch Ed Francis fail and just take over again and have all of his money that he got from Don Owen, who lent him the money, actually, for that purchase. And it didn't work out that way, but that was a lot of guys' plans. Just find a sucker, get the money, and then take over again.
But now here's the thing: Ron Fuller in Southeastern may be an exception to this rule, but yeah. Once the territories were formed, well, what I'm about to tell you, once the territories were formed, the only reason that anybody ever tried to sell them is if there was a problem. whether it'd been a split or a promotional war, or somebody exposed business, or just whatever. Nobody wanted to sell a golden goose. So, which is why that there was any outside ownership in Jim Crockett Promotions, pro wrestling in North and South Carolina and most of Virginia from 1933 until 1988. The Crockett family owned the whole thing all that time. That's the only promotion you can say that about. And that's why business was always so steady. They never had, in the early years, they weren't doing stadium shows, but, well, sometimes they were in Charlotte, but they never had a huge, horrible incident that killed business in the Carolinas, nor did they ever make it big until finally they gambled in the 70s and made it a bigger territory, and it blew up. But that was, if a territory was sold, usually it was in trouble. And I was going to say, except for when Ron started Southeastern, Joe Kazana, he'll love me. Joe Kazana was his grandson, John Kazana, the promoter, had just got old. Wrestling was still doing well there. You see the clippings the year before that. Ron Wright and Don Carson are selling out the Knoxville Civic Coliseum like fucking 6 weeks in a row. But he was just tired, and Ron made a good offer, and he saw he wanted to turn it into a big NWA territory instead of the local group that had, run wrestling there for 25 years. So that was, I'm trying to think of anybody else that actually wanted to get. Nick Goulas didn't want to get out of business when Jerry Jarrett gave him the Mercy payoff in 1980, because the previous 3 years had not been kind to Nick, and who once had ruled the world around there.
Did anyone ever offer you money for Smoky Mountain while it was running?
No, fuck. The fucking millionaires that ran wrestling were losing money in 1995. Nobody ever actually offered us any money to buy the thing.
And Ronnie Gossett never sold it.
Ronnie Gossett, I couldn't get Ronnie to sell it for us either.